Good morning, friends. It's indeed a pleasure to be here, so thank you very much to the entire CA community of Eastern India. It was just a few weeks ago that I had attended and spoken at your World Congress as well, and it's very rarely that I accept an invitation to speak at an event by the same group of people in such a short notice, but I thought it's a good thing to do because I think you are at the forefront of some of the important changes I'm going to talk about just now. As many of you are aware that India has emerged out of this last 2-3 years of COVID crisis stronger than almost anybody had dared to imagine. Obviously, those 2 years were difficult for everybody across the world. But we are now the third largest economy by purchasing power parity, the fifth largest in US dollar terms, and by some margin, the fastest growing major economy in the world, growing somewhere around 7% this financial year, and expected to grow between 6.5% to 7% next year as well. And with growth numbers across the world being sharply reduced, including those of China recently, we are now, in some ways, almost the only bright spot in the world economy. And we have done this economic performance without sacrificing macroeconomic stability. So yes, inflation did very briefly spike up above the 6% top of the Monetary Policy Committee's target range of 2 to 6%, but it's dropped back below that. And this we are managing to do at a time when even developed countries are having difficulty pulling down inflation below double-digit levels. So this is, I would say, a reasonably creditable achievement. So what I want to do first is to very quickly lay out our strategy, which some of you are anyway aware of how did we do it. The first and important thing that we didn't do when faced with the COVID crisis was to look at it as a demand shock, which is what much of the rest of the world did. We understood it, and I would argue now correctly, given that we can now, given what happened subsequently, that this was a supply shock. So therefore, we argued at that time, many of you will remember, that simply trying to pump up the economy using monetary and fiscal tools was just going to be wasting a huge amount of resources, because the problem wasn't that there wasn't demand. The problem was that we had shut the economy down and weren't allowing the transmission of that demand. You couldn't go to the market even if you wanted to buy something. So what is the point of pumping that system? All you will achieve is the equivalent of pressing the accelerator with your foot firmly on the brake. The engine would overheat, and that's precisely what happened to much of the world. And yet, as you will remember, in 2020, 2021, all the economists in the world, particularly those based in US academia, kept telling us that what we should be doing is going and pumping demand, use monetary and fiscal stimulus and pump demand. We continued to be very restrained in our response to great amount of criticism at that time. But what we did do is made sure that we did provide targeted support. We provided targeted support to the very poor using the Jan Dhan or extending free food programs. Since you come from the business community, will remember, we basically provided a very large net, safety net of liquidity and a guarantee program. Much of it, incidentally, didn't get used, but it did provide confidence at that time. And the point we were making is, what India needs is not reinflation, but a safety net. And we provided it. The second and important difference was, and we will now recognize, is that even through all of this, we continued to do supply-side reforms. We opened up large numbers of sectors during the COVID period. We opened up drones, we opened up the space sector, we removed outdated telecom regulations on the OTP sector, on the OSP, that's the BPO sector. We introduced bilateral netting and all kinds of reforms. We even sold off Air India. So the question is, why did we have this approach? The reason for that is this. Our strong view, which we articulated even then, was that the post-COVID world is not a reinflation of the pre-COVID world. This post-COVID world will have its own geopolitics, its own technologies, its own consumer behavior, its own supply chains. And there is no way for us upfront to predict how all of this will evolve. So, what we needed to do was to ensure that the economy was flexible to take advantage of the opportunities of the post-COVID world, rather than simply reinflate the pre-COVID world, hoping that somehow that things would work. So this very different approach at that time was of course much criticized, but I think you will agree that it was the correct thing to do. And it didn't come out of thin air. We have been working on this for some time now. If you look at the reforms that were done even pre-COVID, and you look at what we did systematically, you will see it fits with this general approach of one side being macroeconomic conservatives, and on the other side being supply-side economists. Very different from the demand-side approach of almost every other country in the world. So if you go back to looking at the reforms before COVID, what was it? Create a framework for creating a common market using the GST. GST is a free trade agreement that India did with itself. Similarly, we created the insolvency and bankruptcy framework, and then we cleaned up the banks. We created an anchor for our inflation system by creating an inflation targeting framework, which has more or less worked since then. We have brought down a country which used to be typically in the 8 to 12% inflation range to now mostly in the 2 to 6% inflation rate, leaving aside the recent spike, which has now come off as well. So the point I'm making to you very clearly is that we have an approach. It has now been tried out for a while. Initially, along the way, these steps, necessary as they may be, may appear to be painful. GST imposition was certainly painful. Many of you were at the receiving end of it. But I think most of you will agree that whatever, at the end of now 4 years, 5 years of GST, whatever we have now is a radical improvement on what used to be there before, and that this system can be continuously improved through feedback loops into the future. The same can be said about the insolvency and bankruptcy code and so on and so forth. If we had gone into the crisis with the banking system that we had in 2017, let me assure you, we would have had a banking crisis by now. We spent 2017, 2018, 2019 cleaning up the banks, a very painful thing to do incidentally, and as somebody who had something to do with that cleaning up, let me say, I don't want to go through it ever again. But it did mean that we went into the crisis with a cleaner banking system which was able to take the shock. And today, despite the shock, the Indian banking system is cleaner than it was in 2017, 5 years ago. So this is why, after all of this, we are now at a stage where we can genuinely say that we have an economy that can sustain growth rates, I would argue, somewhere in the 9% range over a long period of time. Now, this doesn't mean that we're going to hit 9% immediately. We do live in particularly uncertain times. There are problems with energy prices fluctuating wildly. There's a war going on in Eastern Europe. There are concerns about liquidity being sucked out by the US Fed. And now, of course, more recently, a re-emergence of COVID in China, among many other risks to the system. And so, given the uncertainties, I don't think the policymakers should be pressing the accelerator and trying to get our economy to grow at 9% just yet. But I just want to let you know that this machine that we have built over the last few years is capable of doing 9% whenever we manage to get a clear highway. And once in a while we do get it. We did get one phase between 2002 and 2007 where the highway was clear, growth rates went up. And there will be periods where we will get it, we will be able to rapidly accelerate out. Meanwhile, managing to do something in the range of 7% is not to be sniffed at. This is a growth rate. It's all about compounding. Many of you understand compounding very well. This is not an audience where I need to explain compounding. But China's current economic success is basically based on 2.5 decades of compounding. So 7%, even 6.5% compounded over time is something that will rapidly take us up. I would say well before the end of this decade, we will have replaced Germany and then Japan and become the third largest economy in the world. But this becoming of third largest economy in the world, let me say, will happen not because just of these reforms we did, but the underlying cause of it is really the fact that over the last decade or so, we have changed inside our heads, our attitudes and approach to the rest of the world. Many of you just heard about how you hosted the World Congress. Now, just a few years ago, you would not have had the confidence of doing it. But now you do. Now you just heard also that you are going to take the Indian model of ICAI and take it to the rest of the world. Not so long ago, you would have been trying to hide behind it in India and trying to prevent others from coming in. But today, you are actually going out and wanting to compete with the rest of the world. Many of you will be egging us on to, in fact, try and do reciprocal arrangements with other countries because you have the confidence that that reciprocity will be exploited by you and not by the other party. This required a major change inside our own head. Now, this doesn't mean that we go out there and engage with the world with our eyes closed. That's not the case. One of the things that this government has done is that we have become very clear about what our interests are. And this makes it much, much easier to engage with the world. Earlier, we used to be afraid of the rest of the world. Today, we are not afraid of the rest of the world, but we engage with it with our own interests in mind. And we are doing this repeatedly. There's the example, for example, where the rest of the world wanted us to join in a trade arrangements called RCEP. We didn't join it because we didn't think it served our national interest. That does not mean that we are afraid of trading in the rest of the world or signing trade pacts. Far from it. We have signed one with Australia, we have signed one with the UAE, we are about to sign one with the UK, and we are in discussions with doing one with the Europeans and the Americans. But we are doing it on our terms. The exact same thing happened when it came to the business of Russian oil. The Europeans, the Americans, and many of their allies did not want us to be importing Russian oil. But as you all know, we made our case clearly, and when we articulated it clearly, we were able to do this on our own terms. This is not because we are warmongers or opportunists trying to take advantage of a difficult situation in Eastern Europe. It's because in the end, we represent a very significant proportion of the world's population and the world's economy, and we need to punch at our own weight. And when we articulate our views clearly, the rest of the world is willing to do a deal. They're willing to bend to us. Of course, we also have to take into account what their requirements are. But this is an India that is willing to stand up for its own interests and also at the same time to engage with the rest of the world. So this is a change in our own approach to the way we deal with the world. Now I will come to the topic that I have been asked to talk about, is about the central role of Kolkata in getting Eastern India up and running again. And you will see the many parallels here. About a month and a half ago, The Economist magazine ran an article where it basically said that India has now become two Indias. That there is a southern India which is rapidly growing and there is a northern India which is lagging behind. Now there was a problem with the evidence they provided for this, because the way they tried to show it is that latitude essentially determined economic success in India. But when they put out a map to prove their point, the thing that really struck you from the map is that it's not actually latitude but longitude. If you simply look at their own evidence, it's very clear that the real divide in India is not north-south, but east-west. There is a very sharp difference between, if you drew a line basically through Varanasi, north-south, the parts of India to the west of it are clearly more prosperous than the parts of India to the east of it. And on every socio-economic indicator that will show up. This is even true not just for the country as a whole, but if there are large states which are long east-west, it even is true in them. So you take Uttar Pradesh, western Uttar Pradesh is more prosperous than eastern Uttar Pradesh. You take Maharashtra, western Maharashtra is more prosperous than eastern Maharashtra. You take Madhya Pradesh, same thing is true. So this east-west issue is a major issue in the country. Now there are many reasons for this, but an important element of this is the role played by major urban hubs or networks in generating economic activity. Now there is very often some idealistic view of creating a rural-driven economic model. And while I have nothing against rural areas, they are lovely to visit, and there is a role for the agriculture and even for rural industry. The fact is, every single developed country in the world is overwhelmingly urban. This is even true of the more developed states in this country. There are many large states in the country, southern and western India, which now are 50% urban. Now, this urban-driven growth model can have different manifestations. In the rest of the world, you can have single major cities like the UK or France, where Paris and London are dominating their landscape. Or you can have the German model with more dispersed model where it can be a network of cities, somewhat medium-sized cities, and so on. And given the size of India, both these models work. You have Gujarat, which has a series of medium-sized cities, or you have Delhi NCR, which is one big urban agglomeration. There are also networks that happen. For example, in the southern India, you have Bangalore, Hyderabad, and Chennai is one network. You have Mumbai, Pune. You can even add Mumbai, Pune, Baroda and Surat as being another network. However you think about it, the fact is that economic growth is heavily dependent on certain urban hubs. In some cases, they're very large single hubs. In other cases, they are networks of hubs. But urban-driven growth is a very important aspect of this. Whether you like it or not, this is critical to rapid growth and development. And whether you like it or not, there will always be, and every single country that has rapidly developed has seen mass migration either to urban hubs or a rural area essentially getting urbanized in some fashion. Rather than fight this, we have to accommodate this and be able to deal with this and have policies for this. Now, turning to Eastern India. One of the things that strikes you about Eastern India is that it does not have any single urban hub that is generating that growth. It does not have a growth network like Bangalore, Chennai, Hyderabad, or the Delhi NCR area. It does not have a single major rapidly growing hub like Mumbai, Pune. And this, in my view, is a role that Kolkata needs to do. Kolkata, despite its relative economic decline, is still by some margin the single largest economic hub in Eastern India. It is a role that Kolkata naturally should aspire to. Because it is not just something that Kolkata needs to do for itself or to do for West Bengal, but it needs to do this for the entire Eastern belt. It needs to build out linkages with Patna, with Ranchi, with Bhubaneswar, with Guwahati, with Imphal. And it is a role that it used to once upon a time do. I know a lot of people have nostalgia for the past of Kolkata. But the past of Kolkata didn't actually end in partition or in the British era. Even in the 50s and 60s, Kolkata actually was still the single largest industrial hub outside of Japan in Asia. Even in 1970, when I was born, Kolkata was by some margin the largest industrial and commercial hub in India. And today, it is not even counted in the top hubs in all of India. This decline happened in my lifetime. In fact, not even in my lifetime, it happened in my teen years. Those of you who lived through it will remember that Kolkata did not lie, it did not die, it was murdered. I am a witness to that murder. Many of you also are a witness to that murder. But the time has come to bring it back. And bringing it back is not to wallow in nostalgia, particularly not that of non-resident Bengalis visiting Kolkata and reliving their college days, which unfortunately happens in this season when holidays happen in the US. Kolkata has to aspire to be a modern city. This requires it to reinvent itself. For example, Kolkata has a beautiful riverfront. I don't know if you've ever gone for a long walk along it. Some bits of it have been cleaned up, but much of it is actually lying derelict. Derelict old docks, derelict old jute mills. There is no reason why we should continue to just aspire to these old jute mills lying derelict and trying to revive them as they are. Every great city in the world has gone and rebuilt and reinvented older parts of the city. You take take London, it has completely reinvented Eastern London and the Docklands. You go to New York, it has completely reinvented Southern Manhattan, which used to be, by the way, a very grimy place till very, very recently. There are entire cool neighborhoods of New York today which are still called the meat packing district. So you know what used to go on there till in its origins. So we also need to begin to, when we talk about reviving Kolkata, it does not mean going and trying to revive the things that used to be there in our grandfather's time. Reviving Kolkata means building for the future. It may mean pulling down entire neighborhoods and rebuilding it to the future, to create utterly modern jobs, to bring in new architecture. Now, this part of the city does have some of that, but it's a very small enclave at best. And even that is, even today, after many, many years of building, is still half built. I think we therefore, when we think of reviving Kolkata, we've got to start by firstly changing our mind. Just like India, till very recently, used to somehow resist the idea of engaging with the world on our own terms, Kolkata needs to engage with the rest of Eastern India, then with the India, and then, of course, with the rest of the world on its own terms. And it needs to do this with confidence about its future, not nostalgia for its past. So let me say that India is embarking on a truly extraordinary journey. The next 20, 25 years is ours for the taking. Our demographics will be in our peak. For the next 25 years, we will have the world's largest workforce. We need to go out there, dramatically expand our industrial base, dramatically expand our services exports, dramatically upgrade our cities. Whether we like it or not, that is where much of this growth will come from. And we need to get Kolkata going again, because a very large part of India is depending on Kolkata to generate that kick in growth. And so with that, let me say that you here in the Chartered Accountants community will play an important part in this. Because however that modernized economy will be, it will have to be based on a culture of trust, trust of accounts, of following rules, of enforcement of contracts, and so on. And all of that will depend heavily on the roots that your community will make here. And of course, there is no reason why you should only play this role for this part of the country. If ICAI is playing this role for the world, well, let Kolkata be the place where it starts. The technology now allows you to do whatever you want to do, no matter where you are. Kolkata, for whatever it's worth, still has a very good hub and clustering of human capital. It still has a culture of excellence. Its infrastructure perhaps needs some upgrading, but I would say that it's not impossible to do. And indeed, some of it is indeed getting upgraded even naturally. It's a cost of doing business is low here. So maybe rather than going around lecturing the rest of the business community about what to do, perhaps you are the place to start. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.